everyone.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. I know we're pushing up against lunch, so thank you all for attending, and big shout out to the Databricks team for organizing such an awesome conference and having us speak. My name is Michael. I'm a product manager within the enterprise data team at Bloomberg, and I'm joined by another Michael, our head of data science at Enterprise Data. You know, if you look through the Michaels speaking at this conference, you have to scroll for a long time. You know, it's like Michael A, Michael B, Michael C. It takes a little bit of time. Before I jump into this presentation about supply chain data, I wanted to spend a few moments to speak to everyone about why Bloomberg is here. You know, I had the pleasure of meeting some of you over the course of this week, and when I say I work at Bloomberg, some of you ask me, are you here to interview someone, or are you here to write a news article about the conference? And while it is the case that Bloomberg has a very large news organization, it actually all started, of course, with the Bloomberg terminal. The Bloomberg terminal sits on the desktop of hundreds of thousands of different decision makers all over the world, and people rely on the terminal to access the data points that really matter to them, that they use to make decisions. Especially in recent years, customers have asked us whether they can take these valuable data points on the Bloomberg terminal and use it in their own model and applications. And of course, that's where Bloomberg Enterprise Data comes in. Our mission is to build APIs, data feeds, and data products that you can use and programmatically access so that you can do deeper research and make the decisions that matter to you. So whether it be news, the terminal, or enterprise data, our mission is really about finding the data points that you care about and then delivering it to you in the way that makes most sense. This brings us to, of course, supply chain data. One of the most interesting parts of my job is the breadth of different customers I get to meet. You know, I speak to portfolio managers, risk analysts who work at large banks, government officials, researchers at central banks. And it's not because I'm a great salesperson or I'm really good at prospecting, but rather it's because it's really important for our customers to understand supply chains deeply, primarily because disruptions can be so expensive. You know, so expensive that McKinsey recently put out a piece of research saying that the average firm stands to lose around 45% of a year's profit as a result of supply chain disruptions over a decade. If we drill down a little bit deeper, the industries that are critical to our economies, such as aerospace, automotive, mining, these industries stand to be disrupted the most. But we don't need an NPV chart to tell us how disruptive supply chain snags can be. You know, we only need to look back to the pandemic and to anyone who may have been looking to purchase a vehicle during that period of time to know how supply chain disruptions can even impact our daily lives. The reason I've been bringing up McKinsey so much is not just because I should say they produce great research, but because they used Bloomberg supply chain data to write research reports on this topic. We believe that really strong visibility is at the core of all supply chain research. What we mean by visibility is fundamentally understanding who a company's suppliers and customers are. And Bloomberg supply chain data provides that visibility for over 100,000 companies. So in this simple example, you can see NVIDIA's suppliers and customers, and of course we have a lot more data, but this is just a visualization. On top of understanding these relationships, customers also need to know the size of the relationships. So it's great to know that TSMC is a supplier to NVIDIA, but can we quantify the amount that NVIDIA is spending with TSMC? And our product also delivers this information when available. Next, history going back to 2006 enables customers to understand how supply chains have evolved over time. For some customers that have trading opportunities use case, for instance, it also enables them to backtest their strategies across time. And lastly, before I move to the next slide, every single relationship that we surface to customers as part of this data set is backed by a source document, meaning that you can drill down to the exact company filing, company presentation, or press release that we used to find this relationship. This is because we know that it's really important for our customers to know that these relationships actually exist so that they have the confidence to make decisions off the back of this data. Now you may be thinking, you know, if every single relationship is backed by a source document and you have humans looking for this data, doesn't that sound really manually intensive and labor intensive? And the truth is that is absolutely correct. And it's actually one of the problems that drew me to this product. One of the ways that we're thinking about supply chain relationships is how we can leverage large language models as well as AI technology to programmatically extract evidence of supply chain relationships from public filings. Our team thought Bloomberg was really well placed to do this because we've been collecting this data for many, many years now. And so while we have a lot of true positives, we almost have just as many false positives. So instances in which a human may have mistaken a partnership for a supply chain relationship, which isn't quite the same. And it turns out that these false positives are really good at helping us fine-tune the LLM to look for supply chain relationships. Importantly, we're keeping a human in the loop as we leverage large language models to find this data for us, for two reasons. The first is we want really detailed annotations. So when the LLM extracts this evidence sentence to us, can we pick it apart to see where it may have fell short or when it got it really right? Secondly, we know our customers still demand that these relationships are validated by a person so that they, again, have that confidence to trade on top of it. We are at the beginning of this journey of using LLMs to find supply chain information, and we expect over time this will help us build a more comprehensive supply chain map, which is of course extremely important for visibility, and we also think this will help us collect the data more efficiently. So I've spent some time speaking about the data, and in the next few slides, I want to talk about how our customers are thinking about this data, as well as how they're using this data. So I'll start off with a very simple example. And of course, this is not investment or trading advice. It's just to help articulate an economic hypothesis, which is that a company's suppliers or its supply chain can be one factor of many that's used to explain firm outperformance. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see Microsoft. Microsoft is embedding a lot of AI into its products, and maybe its share price and maybe its earnings are benefiting as a result. But some investors will come to us and say, hey, I don't want to trade Microsoft directly. Maybe I want to trade one of Microsoft's suppliers or a supplier that has exposure to this AI boom. Using our data, you can see that there are some suppliers that are not related to the AI theme at all. LG Display supplies to Microsoft Surface business and Electronic Arts to its video gaming business. The company that the customer is probably looking for is NVIDIA. This is, again, a very obvious example, not investment advice, but the point we're trying to get across is that by using supply chain data, you can look multiple tiers deep into Microsoft's supply chain and find other companies that may have exposure to a theme that you care about. In this case, you could go a level deeper to TSMC and then to Onto Innovation, which actually provides chip inspection systems to TSMC, and find companies that you think may have not had this price action related to AI already baked into their share price. Again, very simple example, but we have had customers investigate this more deeply. Goldman Sachs, for instance, used Bloomberg supply chain data to investigate the relationship between suppliers and customers and found that the correlation of equity returns between economically related firms in the supply chain are stronger than that of random pairs of firms in the same sector. They also looked at different factors like news arrival intensity, and it additionally found that volume and volatility forecasts can be improved by using supply chain data. I've been speaking at length about investment opportunities, but we started off this discussion talking about disruptions. Customers frequently come to us and ask us whether our data points can be leveraged in such a way to help them spot the next disruption or to act when there is a disruption. Of course, Bloomberg has a very large news organization that's obsessed with finding events or disruptions that may impact a company's earnings or operations. And that forms, a really good feed of headlines and story bodies that our customers can use. But of course, that's generally speaking, maybe not the whole picture. We also have hundreds of news partners that we work with, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, that we leverage to create a real-time feed of these news articles. And in this sort of fictional scenario, you can see maybe Cooper Co., the company in question, its suppliers may have experienced a factory fire that you care about. That's disclosed through one of our news headlines that you can programmatically ingest and apply some NLP techniques to analyze. The solvency of suppliers is, of course, also important to the extent that there is a supplier working with Cooper that defaults or runs into financial issues. That can have knock-on impacts to Cooper's own ability to deliver products to customers. Increasingly, disruptions are happening due to physical risk events, such as earthquakes, wildfires, and typhoons, for instance. And Bloomberg also has a factories data set that maps the latitude and longitude of manufacturing, distribution, administration, and R&D locations. So if, God forbid, there were an earthquake somewhere, you can see whether or not a company has any factory locations there, and additionally, whether its suppliers have any factories there. And Michael Beal in his live demo will show you how we can use some of this content altogether. Before I pass it off to Mike's demo, I want to end off on 3 points. The first is that supply chain data surfaces a lot of insight on its own, but when it is used alongside other content, we see it as being even more powerful. And this is possible because of Bloomberg's unified data model. All of our company data is predicated on a company identifier that you can use to seamlessly join all these data sets together. Second, I've only touched on a few data realms today: supply chain, factories. Bloomberg has a massive ecosystem of data, and my team specifically focuses on data used for research. So we also have company financials data, credit card transactions data, et cetera. And thirdly, and best of all of this data can be used on the Databricks platform, and I think Mike will show you how this can be done. So I'll pass it off to Mike.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So before we jump into the demo, I just wonder, are there any, I have a bad tendency of not leaving a lot of time for questions. I'm going to try to solve for that. But before we jump into the applications of the data, just wanted to pause and see if there's any questions from the things that Michael just spoke about. If not, we can jump in. Yes, please.
Yeah, we see customers also use bills of lading data with supply chain. And that way you have a very comprehensive photo of not just the supply chain relationships, but also the disruptions that can happen at the shipment level. Yeah.
That's a great question. Yes, please.
Thanks. Hey, so you're mentioning using LLMs and using the source data and stuff. I'm just wondering, is there a place for entity resolution somewhere in here so that you know that you're talking about the same suppliers, et cetera? Are you using the LLMs to do any of that?
Yeah, we actually have an in-house entity detection tool that we use that can identify a company name in text and then map it to that company identifier I was speaking to you about. So we use that actually as the first step in the entire extraction process to first identify the companies, and then the LLM determines whether or not there's a relationship.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so we have curated a list of news providers that we believe to be providing credible news. That's the first thing. But actually for the supply chain data set, there's a slight nuance. We only use press releases. So press releases are company issued statements. So they're not written by a journalist or by the media. So it's almost at the same level as a company filing. And so that also gives us additional confidence that there's no fraudulent reporting there.
Yeah. And we'll come to you, just add on to that point. Like when you think about one of the problems that we're seeking to solve, so there's roughly 1 million entities that are represented in the supply chain, right? In terms of that, most of it is coming from company filings. I believe it's probably about 600,000 or so are coming directly from the filings. But if you think through a 10K, companies are not mandated to disclose who are their suppliers unless it reaches some criticality side, right? So as a result, somewhere around 14.6% of the total relationships that we have a numerical value towards it. So these press releases aren't necessarily going to solve for that problem, because it's not like they're going to announce I'm the supplier and this is how much money I'm spending for. But I think, what is it, like 3-4x that we're seeing in the initial analysis that we've done of being able to uncover new relationships that otherwise weren't disclosed. And so one of the things that I'll show as we jump into this is kind of like the network graph that you can create. And I think that actually one of the reasons that I'm excited about supply chain and like to kind of hang out with Michael is, everybody's excited about knowledge graphs. And I think particularly for entities, supply chain serves as a core reference data set for those logical and relational data modeling steps that go into the knowledge graph creation. So this approach of leveraging LLMs on the press releases, while it may not necessarily be able to help you weight the edges, it gives you many more nodes that you can expose throughout the network topology. So great questions. Just wanted to expand upon that. Please, you had one here. There's a mic right next to you.
Yeah, I just want to ask, I saw in the previous slide that there is a human intervention. So is like every document that is scanned goes through the human, and how do you scale that process?
Yeah, so the extractions are being delivered to humans right now for additional annotations. At the moment, we're seeing this as a really great opportunity for us to refine the model to a point where we need to make a decision as to whether or not we keep the humans in the loop or we take a different approach.
So right now, the hallucination or any of that, like that is not because there is a human sitting there to verify that.
Exactly. We're
Okay.
getting the human to weed
Yes.
out the hallucinations.
Okay.
Yeah.
And to his point of having both the false positives and the false negatives, that it inherently gets fed back into the training cycle. And it has pretty good, one thing that's been interesting, and so yeah, I'll use this opportunity to tell you a little bit about myself. So Bloomberg, we stand for a lot of things. I joined the firm, so let me give you a little bit of background. I joined the firm and I help lead our enterprise data science specialists. And what our team is focused on, I'm responsible for the Americas and co-lead it with my colleague Kevin, who is responsible for Europe and Asia. What we're focused on is really helping the firm capture this opportunity to be able to help people who are driving in systematic, quantitative, and AI-driven workflows, right? And as a part of that, obviously, we do some prototyping of new products and work with Michael and other product managers in terms of improving our products, as we talked about with these applications of LLMs. But the other side, which will be some of the stuff that we go through, is helping clients, systematic, quantitative AI in particular, understand how our data can really help them in their workflows and get to better answers. And one of the things that I've learned prior to this, I've spent 8 years more at like kind of a startup hedge fund. We were focused on leveraging first machine learning, well, first big data, then machine learning, then generative AI after the Attention is All You Need paper came out, adversarial network side, not transformers. And before that, I was with JP Morgan. And the thing, Bloomberg stands for a lot of principles and values, many of which Michael hit on, particularly within enterprise data. But I'd say the number one principle that has really stood out to me over this last year is quality, right? We're very obsessed with providing high quality data. And one of the reasons that our data can be so high is because of where Michael started with that terminal, right? We have thousands, hundreds of thousands of users who every day are using this for their critical workflow. So the same data that we're selling in enterprise data is the same data that's powering the terminal. And if somebody on the terminal sees something and they don't like it, they tell us immediately, right? So we get lots of eyes and checks. So going back to your question then, even if we're at like 85% accuracy, call it 90% accuracy, right? That 10, 15% is unacceptable. Whereas in my previous world, in a startup, go fast, break things, where go slower, make sure it's correct, right? So I think that's a lot of what's driving that. So with that background and introduction as to kind of how our team sets up, I'm gonna walk through a demo to kind of bring to life some of the things that we talked about. But I'll give you a little bit of context before. As I mentioned, I come from more of a systematic investment background, and one of the types of strategies that I always really liked was pairs trading. Essentially, you're just asking, you see two securities, they have a relationship, the relationship has spread out, and you ask your question, what is the likelihood that this relationship is going to mean revert to its historical norm over whatever period? In this case, 30 days. I think in the demo, I show like 60 days, right? In that simple world, you're gonna do buy the undervalued and you're gonna short the overvalued, right? That's a general side. I know most people here aren't from the finance side, but that's like the core takeaway as to how this works, right? So if you believe that the relationship is going to revert to the mean, then you're gonna buy the cheap one and you're gonna short the expensive one. You have to be careful of borrowing costs, and when we look at some of the analysis, that's not gonna be there, but everybody has different costs of borrowing. And the benefit of doing a trade in this manner is that in theory, if you've done it correctly and you've positioned size, weighted it, taking into account the volatility and everything else, you should be able to take away the risk of the market moving in a direction over your time period. And you're really just isolating the core thesis associated with your investment, your idea that one name is gonna go up and the other name is either gonna go down or it's not gonna go up by as much. So that's where we're gonna end, right? With this kind of systematic investment workflow. And that's a lot of what our team is focused around. But we're going to start just thinking about it from the fundamental corporation view as to, I want to understand these risks within my supply chain. Because all that I think that the benefit of Bloomberg Enterprise Data and this whole data revolution is now we're enabling machines to do at scale what humans would otherwise be able to do in a smaller batch, right? Being able to dive in, tying in lots of different data to be able to do a quick level of research and conditional weighting as to the probabilities based upon a lot of information that is both core to the decision as well as tangentially related. And that's where machine learning enables us to dive into adding more and more data that is tangentially related. So through this workflow, what we'll look at is taking an idea of leveraging the supply chain, the facilities, news transcripts, ESG, fund index holdings, equity, credit risk, ratings data, and all with the goal of trying to look at the supply chain and provide some level of answering two questions. First question is, for a given company, how important is it to its supply chain ecosystem? All right, is it important or is it off into the peripheral? With the basic idea as to when we drive into the investment side, that companies that if they've gone down, but they're very critical to their ecosystem, they're likely to come back. Whereas if they're not that important, maybe something's happened, they've kind of been pushed off. That's going to be the one around centrality. The other one is going to be around this risk side, where if for whatever reason now there's been a big change in the default risk of company suppliers, or changes into their ESG emissions, or price movements, or negative news articles, we're going to roll up their supply chain to give a weighted score as to the risk associated with that supply chain. And we're similarly going to say that if a company has gone down and it's not that anything has changed with their supply chain and they're not more risky in their supply chain than others, then we'll buy it. But if it's gone down and we're seeing that there's a lot of risks within their supply chain, we're going to stay away from that trade. And we're going to answer the question as to, does adding on those two screens of the supply chain lens of centrality and risk, does that lead to differentiated results than a more naive base of just taking an average spread? So I know, again, not everybody is finance related, but hopefully you generally understand. Am people generally following me? Okay. So through that, we'll also show that this is all made possible because of the DL Plus integration, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Bloomberg, again, when we talk about quality, if you think about the way that anyway, we'll go through that in terms of the data modeling, and I'll touch upon that. And then the general workflow, I'll show it as we go through it, but it's basically we're going to look for companies that in general have had tight spreads, their movement. You think about it, forget words covariance. It's basically just correlation with adjusting for volatility, right? But think of it on a simpler level that companies that have higher correlation, their relationship would probably mean revert more often than companies that have low correlation, right? So we're going to set a filter for just names that have a nice correlation. And then we'll add some binary rules to say that if we see this spread divert, great, we want to buy. And we're just going to do a simple thing of saying, we'll see what happens in 60 days, right? Then get into the training models and moving there. So this is all made possible because Bloomberg, as Michael alluded to and mentioned, we have a tremendous amount of information, right? Over 275 enterprise data sets and growing. Of which out of those 275, I'd say 75 or so have a history that's long enough to train models and do systematic type of workflows. And we sell that all through our marketplace of data.bloomberg.com. And anything that you purchase from us through data.bloomberg.com, then you can very easily instantiate through this DL Plus integration into a Databricks environment and call it on there. But this is our marketplace, and people often ask, why aren't we in the marketplace? We're very well integrated into the ecosystems, but in terms of we'd like to have a very hands-on relationship with our clients. And so Bloomberg's background with everything that started in the terminal all came from the idea of focusing in on reference data, pricing, security masters, regulatory information, right? Really thinking of this primarily as being a back office workflow as to how do you manage all the operations within your organization. But through that, it made us become very focused on this idea of unique keys, primary identifiers, and being very thoughtful around the schema evolution with like largely having some actions in corporate actions. And now with this new evolution, and the group that both Michael and I are part of, is focused entirely around this research data. So we've grown off of that idea of having the fundamental core back office workflows, and now pushing into more and more data sets that can help people not only streamline their operations, but importantly, streamline their research. And I'll talk a lot about like investment management because that's the world I come from. But at the end of the day, all an investment manager is trying to do is predict something that's happening in the future, right? And so all of us, regardless of what we're doing, whether it's in manufacturing, healthcare, transportation, our jobs usually at some point we have to predict something, right? So I think investment management and the techniques that we develop to try to prove in investment management, if they're successful there, they can be very well applied to a variety of different genres. So that's why we'll kind of go through this in this use case. And as you look at where we are in terms of like capturing this opportunity, and helping our clients better enable themselves to make more intelligent solutions or decisions at scale, you'll see that we're still in the early stages of this, right? You see that we have the purple that are products that have been recently released. The dark purple one, second measure down at the bottom, is a credit card transaction data set, which was recently released probably like less than 2 months ago. And then you'll see in the orange that these are some of the ones that are coming in the pipeline over the course of the next year or so, some in months. I think Michael just released a new product yesterday, and we're rapidly rolling this out. So anybody who's focused on research, I just really want to hammer home this idea that Bloomberg is not just a reference data and pricing back office. Like we are explicitly here to help clients make better decisions, particularly anybody who's thinking about systematic workflows. And this business is new enough that we're super eager for feedback and for the ability to improve our products. So I'll just take this moment to ask the Bloomberg representatives in the room to put up your hands. We have Rob, Catherine, Penn, and Spletla here. Please speak with us after this event or anytime else, and we'd love to be able to work with you. All right, with all of that, the core flow here is now that we talked about how we're managing our environments and how we're pulling everything together. The Data License Plus, which comes into the modeling side, really makes it such that if you think about each product, great products, they were thought of for internal consistency within their product, less so about how do they link to other products in the world that they were given in. So within there is a schema that enables you to find the unique ID of any given product and how you're going to link it to other products. And that's all great. And if you want to do it that way and do the work, it's very doable, it's very clean. The problem with that is you have to do it, and schemas change all the time. So what the Bloomberg Data License Plus management system does is it's really looking at it through the lens of every entity has an instrument that is associated with it. Every instrument trades on a market, and on every instrument in a market, there's a price for that. And then once you've done those core linkings, then any given data set that you're looking at or product is very easily tied into that so that you can have this 360-degree view of any entity that you're looking at. And then that's seamlessly delivered either through FTP, REST protocols, or as we're all here to talk about, into your DL Plus or into your Databricks instantiation. So yes, the unified data model makes life easier. And with that, let's jump into this workflow around pairs trading. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do here, good, I left myself just enough time.
One thing I'll say while he's setting up is try not to do a product release in the same week that you're attending your conference, because it does get pretty crazy, I would say.
Interesting. Hopefully it's going to pull up my screen. It was working before. Sorry for this. You know why it's not mirroring my screen now? Yeah. Should I use the settings, the questions during this time? Please. Yeah, let's see it though. Oh, you have it on extend, just duplicate. Yeah, there we go. All right, we're back. Thank you. Thanks for somebody asking a question. Okay, so what we're gonna do here, and perfect, we have just enough time. So the first thing that we're gonna do, won't go through all the queries, kind of talk through how we do it in the side. I will just touch on here. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna load in that supply chain data set. All right, and if we take a look and kind of illustrate one of the items that Michael was talking about here. So now what we see is a visual representation of that graph effect that I was talking about with Apple, right? So we have here Apple suppliers. You can see in this first ring are their tier 1 suppliers. Out here, kind of their tier 2 suppliers. And then down here are their tier 3 suppliers. So as we think through again with that value proposition of that unified data model, it becomes very easy to link all of the other data sets that we have access to. And that's one of the reasons I joined Bloomberg, was to be able to have unfettered free access to all of the data within the ecosystem. And in the right along this table, you can see now that we're just appending all of the other information that we've loaded. So we talked about default risk. So now we're looking at the default risk of, what is the company? So within Apple, we have the probability that in the next 5 years, it's going to go bankrupt. You see that within the next 1 year, we're saying there's literally no probability that it's going to go bankrupt. The market implied, so what is the market saying about what the likelihood is that the company will go bankrupt? We have other things around the climate, physical risk, anything around sanctions counts, et cetera. And then we can look at that not only on Apple as that core, but we can go 2 layers deep to now look at a company called BOE Technology Group, right, which has ranked higher on our risk score. And we can see that that's largely driven by increases in the probability of its default risk. So with each one of these, this ability, as I talk back to this initial idea of the knowledge graph and being able to look at the network, this ability to not only have a very clear understanding of that first level of relationship, but then also to dive deeper down to second levels and third levels and tie in all this information is going to be core to our ability to then, as you look at how we've color-coded each individual entity, to roll that back up to be able to provide a consolidated risk score for Apple itself. And we can continuously, if we go a little bit deeper into here, we can look at some of the advanced sides and we can color code it by anything that we want, right? Whether it's the GHG, we can look at it based off of the news sentiment, however we want to think about the weightings and the risk and how we define it. We have the flexibility to be able to do that because we've been able to merge it all into a simple data frame that's going to be able to tie it through. The other side that I just wanted to hit on as we look at that supply chain component, if I go back here, is what I'll show once this finishes reloading is then that ability to then tie it in with the facilities information to be able to have a geographic viewpoint as to these risks that are actually occurring. Actually shouldn't have refreshed that. So as we come into here, we'll look at another scenario leveraging the supply chain where we want to, instead of just looking at the data set of the supply chains, now we want to ask ourselves, well, what happens if, in this case, there was a hurricane in Japan, and we want to be able to see, based off of looking at the suppliers to Toyota, and then looking at the facilities of their suppliers, how are they likely to be impacted during this hurricane? And so we're mapping the path of the hurricane over the actual facilities that are happening. So this is the type of kind of deep fundamental diligence that a user can be able to perform very simply, all through just this unified data model, linking things together, pulling together lots of different pieces of information. In this case, the weather is just an open source piece of information that is also easily tied into that. So that level of depth is something that I think really adds a lot of value to any core fundamental investment use case. Now, or research use case, period. So the next thing that we'll do, and I won't go into the details around each one of these data sets the way I did with the supply chain, is we're gonna look at the company segment fundamentals and we're gonna tie that in. The question here is just where are people driving their revenue from, right? Obviously Apple, if you looked at it, it's getting most of its revenue on a top line, but it has growth in terms of the mobile device units. If you just look at it as its top line, you're only gonna see it as a technology company or a consumer discretionary company. If you look at it levels deeper, you're gonna get a much more granular understanding as to what's actually driving the revenues of the company. So we wanna pull in actually what percentage of the revenue for each company is coming from any given sector. And in this case with this company here, we see 95% is coming from aircraft and parts, which is Boeing, versus 4.1, which is coming from 4.1% is coming from air freight. We'll then pull in the sanctions data set, the default risk data sets, and the carbon emissions data sets as well. And now we're just going back to that graph that we showed in the previous slide here, or in this previous screen. And now we have a full view as to not only the direct relationships within the supply chain, but then also the network graph that's amongst it. And so we're gonna feed that into a network graph, and we're gonna ask ourselves the question, as I mentioned, as to what is the centrality for each company? How critical is it to its given suppliers? And we're normalizing this from 0 to 10, and you see kind of in general, most of the companies are somewhere in this bucket in terms of the level of criticality that they represent. We'll then continue to load in the facilities and some other risk factors, and I'll skip through this, such that we can then come into this place where we've abstracted this so that we don't, I'm sure some of you probably work at these companies. So we've just abstracted away what are the company names. But now we can see very easily for any given company, in this case the metal manufacturer, where does it fit within its given ecosystem and what are the risks that we're applying to the various nodes within that network based upon all those various data sets that we pulled in before. And we can look at that on an individual level, or we can look at that on a very broad network level, where we decide, and this is what we're going to leverage for the pairs trading use case, where we decide that we're going to take a couple of companies and we're going to look at what's the overlap between their network graph and see how much importance and how much shared risk is there within that graph. So that portion of this in terms of being able to analyze large amounts of data, more on a very specific case-by-case basis, tie in lots of information, be able to understand how important is a company to its supply network, how important is it to ancillary networks, as well as what are the risks that are present within that network, is something that's made very easy within the DL Plus interface. So then with this idea, then we're gonna now come into this answering the question of the pairs trading scenario. So in addition to the supply chain, default risk, sanctions, and other information that we had previously pulled in, now we're gonna look at pricing information. We're gonna pull in just the company, leveraging the point-in-time company pricing and fundamentals. We're gonna leverage the DL Plus interface and pull in that full universe. But importantly, what we've highlighted here is that if you look at this covariance matrix side that we talked about, essentially what we're trying to solve for is we have an understanding of how often is it that these companies are coming back together and how correlated are they. And just to highlight very clearly, so it says ADV Micro and Adobe are more related to each other than American Express and Amgen. And below we have a very large matrix that represents that. Come down here. So we're gonna take that entire matrix and we're only gonna focus in on the ones that have basically in the top quintile of the relationship matrix, as well as then we're going to ask ourselves the question of what happens if we were to do some filtering in terms of saying that we want them to have some supply chain overlap or some other risks associated with it, as we talked about. So if we come back to here, what we now see is that the spreads between any given company, they can range from, in this case, Schwab versus UPS, it's 14x on average. But if we change that, many of them are, as we saw, more in like the 0.1, 0.2. So what that leads to is it's very difficult just off of the spreads to be able to have some comparisons. We have some where one company is worth 800 times the other company, and most of them are down here in this 0 level. So we'll then normalize that to just be able to look at it as to how is the spread today compared to its 90-day rolling average. And so we're taking the rolling 90-day mean, and we're just dividing today's observation versus that. Kind of like a threshold is where we're heading off to this. And you can see now that we've normalized the range to be from 0.5 to 2. Companies don't usually get more than two times what their historical relationship is. So this is the matrix that we're going to use as our observation. And now we're going to set this entry threshold. And you can see, in this case, it's on the y-axis, we have time, and on the x-axis, we've now taken about 30 names factorial, so about 900 different permutations, and come up with observations of times that we might be able to invest. So as we set this threshold to saying that, well, when are the times that the spread has become more than 1.25 times what its rolling average has been over the last 90 days, we now see that narrows our investment universe to these sparse dots that we have happening. And so we'll set out the logic here that we want to say that any time one of these observations occurs and it's more than 1.25, we're going to buy and then and short the undervalued, and then we're going to close out the trade in 60 days and see what happens. And the core takeaway from that we were able to find is that on average, when you're already looking at names that are highly correlated and their spreads usually mean revert through what we saw in that covariance matrix observation, that on average will deliver you about a 1.6% return. Now, this is where I was talking about borrowing costs, like you won't actually be able to capture that full 1.6%. But importantly, when we then take the return and we add on that layer of the supply chain risk and we say, we're not going to buy if the supply chain of the company that went down is now at risk, right? We're going to ignore that trade. Well, then we see that our average return jumps up by roughly 40% to 2.26% returns, right? So for those, I see some people who work at hedge funds and they're shaking their heads, so I'm happy about that. They understand where we're heading. For most people, I understand that that's probably not in the detail of there. But the core takeaway is that for what is a very hard world of investment management making predictions and a very known strategy that you want to be able to do these spread reversion type of statistical arbitrage, without adding too much fancy machine learning on top of this, we're able to just very clearly see that when we put a static threshold by combining supply chain risk to our investment strategies, we get really differentiated results. Therefore, we're making really differentiatedly better predictions. And that ability to make better predictions is core to every problem that I think anybody who's at Databricks is trying to solve. And I'm pretty excited. I was working on this last night, actually, and I was excited to see that the results came out the way that I was expecting them to. And for anybody who'd like to dive into the code or talk about applications for your workflow, we'd love to set up a call over the coming days or weeks. Hopefully this was helpful and interesting. We're both very passionate and excited about supply chain and what it can represent for systematic AI-driven and quantitative research over the days, months, and years to come. And we're really excited to be growing our relationship with Databricks and look forward to being able to have the opportunity to work with you all in the future. As I said, batted questions, so thank you very much.